The morning sun cast long shadows across the presidential palace in Ouagadougou as Ibrahim Traore reviewed the encrypted message that had arrived during the night. The young captain, barely 34 years old, had become Burkina Faso's leader through a military coup just months earlier. Now, as he read the carefully worded warning from a coalition of West African traditional rulers, his jaw tightened with determination rather than fear. The message was clear and unmistakable. 5 powerful kings from across the region had joined forces to deliver an ultimatum that would have made lesser men tremble. King Otumfuo Osei Tutu II of the Ashanti Kingdom in Ghana, the Uni of Ife from Nigeria, the Kabaka of Buganda from Uganda, and 2 other influential monarchs had signed their names to a document that read more like a death sentence than diplomatic correspondence. Captain Traore, the message began with deliberate formality. Your recent actions have disturbed the delicate balance that has maintained peace in our region for decades. The contracts with foreign mining companies, the agreements with international partners, and the established order of trade must be respected. We strongly advise you to reconsider your path before it leads to consequences that cannot be undone. The warning referred to Traore's bold decision to review all foreign mining contracts in Burkina Faso, particularly those involving gold extraction. The young leader had discovered that his country, despite being rich in gold reserves, remained one of the poorest nations in Africa. Foreign companies were extracting billions of dollars worth of gold while leaving barely anything for the Burkinabe people. Schools lacked basic supplies, hospitals operated without essential medicines, and roads remained unpaved, even as international corporations shipped truck after truck of precious metals to foreign shores. But the king's warning went deeper than just mining rights. They spoke of established relationships, of powerful interests that stretched across continents, and of the dangerous precedent that Traore's nationalism might set for other young African leaders. The traditional rulers had built their own relationships with these same foreign interests over many years. They received benefits, respect, and influence in return for maintaining stability and predictable business environments. Traore set the message aside and walked to the window overlooking the bustling streets of his capital city. Below, he could see vendors selling goods from wooden carts, children walking to school in patched uniforms, and mothers carrying water containers on their heads because reliable piped water remained a luxury in many neighborhoods. These were his people, the ones who had suffered while foreign companies and their local partners grew wealthy from Burkina Faso's natural resources. The young captain had not sought power for personal gain. His military background had taught him discipline, strategy, and the importance of protecting those who could not protect themselves. When he led the coup that brought him to power, he had done so with a clear vision of transforming his country from a source of raw materials for foreign industries into a nation that benefited from its own wealth. His advisors had already warned him about the pressure he would face. The international community did not appreciate leaders who questioned existing arrangements, especially when those arrangements had been profitable for decades. Foreign embassies had begun requesting meetings with increasing urgency. International news outlets had started publishing articles questioning his legitimacy and stability. Financial institutions had begun discussing the possibility of sanctions or reduced cooperation. Now, with the formal warning from the African kings, Traore understood that the pressure was becoming coordinated and serious. These traditional rulers commanded respect across the continent. Their words carried weight not just with their own people, but with international partners who had learned to work through established local leadership structures rather than dealing with unpredictable military governments. The captain knew that his next moves would determine not just his own fate, but the future direction of his country and possibly the entire region. Other young leaders across Africa were watching to see whether it was possible to challenge the established order and survive. The kings were watching to see whether their authority and influence could still control ambitious newcomers. International partners were watching to see whether their investments and agreements would remain secure. As evening approached, Traore called his closest advisors to a private meeting. The men and women who gathered in the secure conference room had all chosen to support his vision of an independent Burkina Faso despite knowing the risks involved. They represented different backgrounds, former military officers, economists, educators, and community leaders. But they shared a common belief that their country deserved better than its current situation. The message from the king's changes. Nothing, Traore announced as he showed them the warning. We knew this day would come. We knew that challenging decades of exploitation would not be easy or safe. But we also know that continuing on the old path means condemning another generation of our children to poverty, while foreign corporations become wealthy from our gold. The room fell silent as each advisor considered the implications. They all understood that defying the king's warning would mean crossing a line from which there might be no return. But they also understood that their leader had already made his choice, and now they had to decide whether to follow him into uncertain territory or step back while they still could. Outside the palace walls, the people of Burkina Faso went about their evening routines, unaware that their young leader had just received a warning that could reshape the future of their nation and the entire West African region. 3 weeks after receiving the king's warning, Ibrahim Traore made a decision that would send shockwaves across Africa and beyond. Instead of backing down or seeking compromise, he announced the immediate suspension of all gold mining operations by foreign companies until new agreements could be negotiated that would benefit the Burkinabe people directly. The announcement came during a nationally televised address that Traore delivered in simple, direct language that every citizen could understand. Standing behind a podium decorated with the colors of Burkina Faso's flag, the young captain spoke without the flowery diplomatic language that politicians typically used when discussing sensitive international matters. My fellow Burkinabe, he began, looking directly into the camera. For too long we have watched trucks filled with our gold leave our borders while our children go to school in buildings with no roofs, and our hospitals lack basic medicines. This ends today. From this moment forward, any company that wants to extract gold from our soil must agree to terms that benefit our people, not just foreign shareholders. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Within hours, phone calls were flooding government offices from foreign embassies, international mining companies, and regional leaders. The stock prices of several multinational corporations with operations in Burkina Faso dropped sharply on international markets. News networks began broadcasting urgent reports about the crisis in West Africa. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. In villages and towns across Burkina Faso, people began gathering in the streets to celebrate. For the first time in decades, many citizens felt that their government was actually working for them rather than for foreign interests. Young people who had been planning to migrate to Europe or other African countries to find opportunities suddenly began talking about staying home to help build their own nation. The international mining companies affected by Traore's decree responded with a carefully coordinated campaign designed to pressure him into reversing his decision. They began by suspending all operations and sending their foreign employees home, creating immediate unemployment in several mining towns. Then they started legal proceedings in international courts, claiming that Burkina Faso was violating existing contracts and international trade agreements. More concerning for Traore was the response from neighboring governments. The presidents of several West African countries began making public statements expressing concern about instability in Burkina Faso and the need for responsible leadership in the region. These leaders had their own relationships with international mining companies and feared that Traore's example might inspire similar movements in their own countries. The African kings who had issued the initial warning were furious. King Otumfuo, Ose Tututu, called an emergency meeting of traditional rulers to discuss what they described as an unprecedented challenge to established authority. The Uni of Ife issued a public statement saying that young leaders who refuse wise counsel from their elders are destined for failure and will bring suffering to their people. But Traore had anticipated this resistance, and he had spent the weeks following the king's warning preparing for exactly this scenario. Working with a small team of trusted economists and legal experts, he had developed a comprehensive plan for restructuring his country's relationship with its natural resources. The new policy he announced required all mining companies to establish processing facilities within Burkina Faso, rather than simply extracting raw materials for processing elsewhere. This meant that instead of shipping raw gold ore to refineries in other countries, companies would have to build refineries in Burkina Faso, creating thousands of local jobs and keeping more of the value-added production within the country. Additionally, the new agreements required foreign companies to partner with local businesses and train Burkinabe citizens in technical skills related to mining and processing. A percentage of all profits had to be invested directly in local infrastructure projects, including schools, hospitals, and roads in the communities where mining operations were located. Perhaps most revolutionary was Traore's announcement that Burkina Faso would begin accepting payment for its gold in currencies other than the traditional Western currencies that had dominated African trade for decades. The country would now accept payment in Chinese yuan, Russian rubles, and even cryptocurrency, breaking free from the financial systems that had historically given Western powers significant leverage over African governments. The announcement of these new policies triggered an even more intense international response. Western governments began discussing potential sanctions against Burkina Faso. The International Monetary Fund suggested that the country might face difficulties accessing international loans and development assistance if it continued on this path. Several international banks began restricting financial services to Burkinabe institutions. However, Traore had also been building new relationships that would help his country weather this storm. In the months leading up to his confrontation with the kings, he had quietly reached out to countries like Russia, China, and Turkey, exploring alternative partnerships that could provide the technical expertise, investment capital, and market access that Burkina Faso would need to develop its resources independently. These new partners were interested in working with African leaders who were willing to challenge Western dominance in the region. They offered not just economic cooperation but also security assistance to help protect governments that chose to pursue independent policies. For Traore, these relationships represented a potential pathway to genuine sovereignty for his country. As news of Burkina Faso's bold new policies spread across Africa, something unexpected began to happen. Young people in other African countries started organizing rallies and demonstrations supporting Traore's example. University students in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa began demanding that their own governments review foreign mining contracts and prioritize national development over international corporate profits. The movement was spreading beyond Burkina Faso's borders, and the established powers who had issued the original warning were beginning to realize that they were facing something much larger and more dangerous to their interests than one rebellious young captain. The pressure on Ibrahim Traore reached a dangerous new level when a meeting took place in Accra, Ghana, that would change everything. The 5 African kings who had initially warned Traore gathered with representatives from major international mining corporations and several Western diplomats in a private conference room at one of the city's most exclusive hotels. The meeting was supposed to be secret, but Traore's intelligence network had grown more sophisticated since he took power. Within hours of the gathering, detailed reports of the discussions were on his desk in Ouagadougou. What he read made him realize that the situation had escalated far beyond diplomatic pressure or economic sanctions. According to his sources, the participants in the Accra meeting had discussed a coordinated plan to remove Traore from power. The plan involved supporting opposition groups within Burkina Faso, encouraging military officers who disagreed with Traore's policies to act against him, and potentially recognizing an alternative government if such a coup succeeded. The African kings had agreed to use their influence to legitimize any new leadership that would restore the previous arrangements with foreign mining companies. In return, they would receive substantial financial support for various projects in their own territories, as well as continued recognition of their authority and status in international forums. For the international corporations involved, the plan represented a necessary investment to protect billions of dollars in existing contracts and future mining rights across West Africa. They feared that if Traore's example succeeded in Burkina Faso, similar movements would emerge in other resource-rich African countries, potentially costing them trillions of dollars in lost profits over the coming decades. When Traore shared this intelligence with his closest advisors, the room fell silent. Everyone understood that they were now facing an existential threat that went far beyond economic pressure or diplomatic isolation. Foreign powers and their local allies were actively working to overthrow the government and potentially eliminate Traore himself. However, instead of becoming paralyzed by fear, Traore made another decision that would shock both his enemies and his supporters. Rather than trying to hide or deny the information about the plot against him, he decided to go public with everything he knew. In a dramatic televised address that interrupted regular programming across Burkina Faso, Traore stood before the nation and revealed the details of the conspiracy he had uncovered. He named the African kings involved, identified the foreign corporations and diplomats who had participated in the meeting, and explained exactly what they had planned for his country. "My fellow citizens," he said, his voice steady despite the gravity of what he was revealing, "I want you to understand exactly what we are fighting against. We are not just fighting for better contracts or more money from our gold. We are fighting against a system that believes African nations should never be allowed to control their own resources or determine their own futures." The revelation sent shockwaves across the continent and beyond. The named African kings initially denied involvement, but leaked audio recordings from the Accra meeting soon appeared on social media and international news outlets. The evidence was undeniable, and the traditional rulers found themselves facing the most serious crisis of legitimacy they had experienced in decades. The response from ordinary Africans was swift and decisive. In Ghana, thousands of young people gathered outside the Ashanti king's palace demanding explanations for his involvement in the plot against Traore. In Nigeria, university students organized protests calling for the Uni of Ife to distance himself from foreign interference in African affairs. Similar demonstrations erupted in Uganda, Cameroon, and several other countries where traditional rulers had been implicated. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. Other African military officers and government officials who had been quietly watching Traore's example. Within days of his revelation about the conspiracy, similar announcements began coming from leaders in Mali, Niger, and Guinea, all declaring their intention to review foreign mining contracts and prioritize national development over international corporate interests. The movement that the established powers had tried to prevent was now spreading faster than ever. Young African leaders who had previously been cautious about challenging the existing order suddenly realized that they were not alone, and that there was growing popular support for genuine independence from foreign economic domination. Traore used this momentum to announce the next phase of his plan for transforming Burkina Faso. Working with technical experts from Russia and China, his government would establish a sovereign wealth fund based on gold revenues that would finance massive infrastructure development projects. New universities would be built to train the next generation of African engineers, doctors, and scientists. Modern hospitals would be constructed in every major city and town. Most importantly, Traore announced the creation of a Pan-African alliance of nations committed to resource sovereignty. Any African country that wanted to join could access shared technical expertise, alternative financing mechanisms, and mutual defense agreements that would help protect them from the kind of destabilization efforts that Burkina Faso was facing. The international response to these announcements was swift and severe. Several Western governments imposed sanctions on Burkina Faso and threatened similar measures against any countries that joined Traore's alliance. International financial institutions suspended all loans and development assistance to the affected nations. Major news outlets began broadcasting stories about instability and authoritarianism in West Africa. However, these pressure tactics had an unexpected consequence. Rather than frightening other African leaders away from Traore's example, the harsh international response convinced many people that he must be doing something right. If Western governments and corporations were working so hard to stop him, many Africans reasoned, then his policies must truly threaten the system that had kept Africa poor while other regions prospered. Young Africans across the continent began organizing themselves into networks that supported Traore and similar leaders. They used social media to share information about resource extraction, corruption, and alternative development models. They organized boycotts of companies that were trying to pressure African governments. They created new media outlets that told stories from African perspectives rather than through the lens of foreign interests. The kings and other traditional authorities who had tried to stop Traore found themselves increasingly isolated from the people they claimed to represent. Their legitimacy, which had been based partly on their ability to serve as intermediaries between their communities and the outside world, was now being questioned by a generation that no longer accepted the old arrangements. 6 months after exposing the conspiracy against him, Ibrahim Traore faced his greatest test yet, when the effects of international sanctions began to bite deeper into Burkina Faso's economy. Foreign banks had cut off most financial services, making it difficult for businesses to conduct international trade. Several international aid organizations had suspended their operations, affecting healthcare and education programs that many communities depended on. The African kings who had warned him initially now watched with grim satisfaction as news reports highlighted the economic difficulties facing Burkina Faso. King Otumfuo Osei Tutu II gave interviews to international media outlets, expressing deep concern for the suffering of the Burkinabe people under reckless leadership. The UNIAVIF organized a conference of traditional rulers to discuss restoring stability and prosperity to West Africa. These traditional leaders believed that the economic pressure would eventually force Traore to compromise, or that his own people would turn against him as hardships increased. They had seen this pattern before. Young African leaders who challenged the established order typically lasted only a few months before being forced to accept the old arrangements or being replaced by more cooperative successors. However, Traore had spent those 6 months preparing for exactly this scenario. Working with his new partners in Russia and China, he had established alternative financial systems that allowed Burkina Faso to conduct international trade without relying on Western banks. Chinese companies agreed to purchase gold directly from Burkina Faso using yuan payments, while Russian firms provided technical equipment and expertise in exchange for mining partnerships. More importantly, the domestic effects of Traore's policies were beginning to show positive results that ordinary citizens could see and feel. The first gold processing facility built under the new requirements had opened in Ouagadougou, providing jobs for over 2,000 local workers. Revenue from the facility was being used to build new schools in rural areas that had never had proper educational facilities. Construction had begun on a modern hospital in Bobo Dioulasso that would serve the entire southwestern region of the country. Solar power installations were bringing electricity to villages that had been without reliable energy for decades. New roads were connecting remote communities to major markets, allowing farmers to sell their products more efficiently and at better prices. These improvements were happening at a time when neighboring countries that had maintained traditional relationships with foreign corporations were experiencing their own difficulties. Ghana was struggling with debt payments to international creditors. Nigeria was facing fuel shortages despite being a major oil producer. Mali was dealing with security problems that the presence of foreign military contractors had failed to resolve. The contrast was becoming clear to people across the region. Countries that prioritized the interests of foreign corporations and their local partners were not necessarily more stable or prosperous than those that pursued independent policies. In fact, Burkina Faso was beginning to look like an example of what might be possible when a country truly controlled its own resources. This realization triggered a new wave of support for Traore that extended beyond Africa's borders. Progressive politicians in Europe and America began citing Burkina Faso as an example of successful resistance to exploitative international economic arrangements. Environmental activists praised the country's sustainable development approach, which emphasized local processing and renewable energy rather than raw material extraction for foreign markets. International human rights organizations, which had initially been skeptical of a military leader, began acknowledging that Traore's government was delivering real improvements in education, healthcare, and living standards for ordinary citizens. Academic institutions started inviting Burkinabe officials to share their experiences and discuss alternative development models. The growing international support for Traore's approach created a new problem for the African kings and their foreign partners. Their narrative that his policies were reckless and destabilizing was being contradicted by observable evidence of success and by respected international voices that were praising his achievements. Faced with this changing dynamic, the kings decided to escalate their opposition in a way that would shock even their most cynical critics. King Otumfuo Ose Tutu II announced that he was organizing a Council of African Wisdom that would formally recognize alternative leadership in Burkina Faso. The plan was to identify military officers or civilian politicians who opposed Traore's policies and declare them the legitimate representatives of the Burkinabe people. This announcement represented an extraordinary step for traditional rulers who had historically stayed out of direct political conflicts. By attempting to designate alternative leadership for a sovereign nation, they were essentially declaring war on the principle of national self-determination that had been established when African countries gained independence from colonial rule. The response from across Africa was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. Even traditional rulers who had not been involved in the anti-Traore conspiracy began distancing themselves from the Council of African Wisdom. They understood that accepting the precedent of kings choosing leaders for other countries could eventually threaten their own authority and legitimacy. More importantly, the announcement backfired spectacularly in terms of popular opinion. Millions of Africans who had been following the conflict between Traore and the kings suddenly realized that the traditional rulers were willing to undermine African sovereignty itself in order to protect their relationships with foreign interests. Protests erupted outside royal palaces across the continent. In Ghana, demonstrators surrounded the Ashanti king's residence demanding that he renounce his involvement in the Council of African Wisdom. In Nigeria, the Uni of Ife faced the largest protests against traditional authority that the country had seen since independence. Traditional rulers in other countries began receiving delegations from their own communities demanding explanations for their silence about foreign interference in African affairs. The crisis was spreading beyond the original conflict between Traore and the mining companies. It had become a continent-wide debate about the role of traditional authority, the meaning of independence, and the future direction of African development. Traore seized this moment to announce the most ambitious phase of his transformation plan. Yet, Burkina Faso would host a Pan-African conference on resource sovereignty that would bring together progressive leaders, young activists, traditional rulers who supported independence, and technical experts from around the world. The goal would be to develop a comprehensive framework for African countries to control their own resources while building mutually beneficial relationships with international partners. The conference would take place in Ouagadougou in 3 months, and Traore invited every African leader to attend, including the kings who had opposed him. It was a bold gambit that would either establish him as a continental leader or provide his enemies with an opportunity to isolate and defeat him once and for all. The weeks leading up to the Pan-African Conference in Ouagadougou were filled with diplomatic maneuvering, international pressure, and unexpected developments that would reshape the entire conflict. Ibrahim Traore had issued invitations to 54 African nations, traditional rulers from across the continent, and international observers from countries that supported resource sovereignty. The response was unprecedented in modern African politics. 37 African presidents and prime ministers confirmed their attendance, including several leaders who had previously been critical of Traore's policies. Traditional rulers from 22 countries accepted invitations, though notably the 5 kings who had originally warned Traore announced they would boycott the conference entirely. King Otumfuo Ose Tutu II issued a public statement declaring the conference an illegitimate gathering organized by an unstable military regime. The Uni of Ife went further, warning other traditional rulers that attending the conference would be a betrayal of the wisdom and stability that traditional authority represents. However, their boycott had an unexpected consequence. Younger, traditional leaders, including several crown princes and heirs to various thrones, announced that they would attend the conference despite their elders' opposition. Prince Nana Akufo-Addo of a prominent Ghanaian royal family declared that traditional authority must evolve with the times and serve the interests of African people, not foreign corporations. The international response to the conference was intense and revealing. Western governments pressured their allies not to attend, with several European embassies warning that countries participating in the conference might face reduced development assistance and trade opportunities. The United States State Department issued a statement expressing concern about destabilizing activities in West Africa. But other international powers saw the conference as an opportunity to expand their influence in Africa. China announced that it would send a high-level delegation led by a deputy prime minister. Russia confirmed that senior officials from their Foreign Ministry and Natural Resources Department would participate. Turkey, India, and Brazil all sent substantial delegations, recognizing that the conference could reshape global trade relationships. As delegates began arriving in Ouagadougou, the transformation of Burkina Faso under Traore's leadership became impossible to ignore. International journalists who came to cover the conference found a city that had changed dramatically in just 1 year. New roads connected the airport to the city center. Solar panels powered streetlights throughout the capital. Construction cranes dotted the skyline as new hospitals, schools, and processing facilities rose from the ground. The gold processing facility that had opened 6 months earlier was now operating at full capacity, employing over 3,000 local workers and generating revenue that was funding infrastructure projects across the country. Technical training centers established with Chinese and Russian assistance were graduating hundreds of skilled technicians each month. The new university campus was preparing to welcome its first class of students studying mining engineering, renewable energy, and sustainable development. Foreign correspondents interviewing ordinary citizens found overwhelming support for Traore's policies, despite the economic challenges created by international sanctions. A market vendor in Ouagadougou told a BBC reporter, "Before, our gold left the country and we got nothing. Now we have jobs, our children have schools, and our hospitals have medicines. We can accept some difficulties while we build our own future." Shaktarir. Opening ceremony of the conference was broadcast live across Africa and watched by an estimated 200 million people. Traore's opening speech was delivered in 3 languages, French, English, and Swahili, to ensure maximum accessibility. Across the continent, he spoke without notes, addressing the delegates and the television audience with the same direct, honest style that had made him popular with ordinary Africans. "We gather here not to reject cooperation with the international community," he said, "but to insist that cooperation must be based on mutual respect and shared benefits. Africa has fed the world with its resources for centuries while remaining hungry. Africa has powered international development while remaining in darkness. This must change, and it will change, starting with our generation." The conference sessions that followed were unlike anything seen before in African diplomacy. Instead of the formal scripted discussions typical of continental gatherings, the Ouagadougou conference featured open, sometimes heated debates about resource extraction, development models, and relationships with foreign powers. The most dramatic moment came when President Félix Tshisekedi of the Democratic Republic of Congo announced that his country would immediately begin reviewing all mining contracts involving cobalt and copper extraction. The DRC contains the world's largest reserves of cobalt, a mineral essential for electric vehicle batteries and renewable energy systems. Tshisekedi's announcement meant that the electric vehicle industry and the global transition to renewable energy could be significantly affected by changes in African resource policies. Similar announcements followed from other leaders. The president of Zambia declared a review of copper mining agreements. The leader of Guinea announced new requirements for bauxite processing within the country rather than raw material export. The president of Tanzania revealed plans to renegotiate gold mining contracts using Burkina Faso's new model as a template. By the 3rd day of the conference, it was clear that something historic was happening. What had begun as pressure on one young military leader in a small West African country had evolved into a continent-wide movement for resource sovereignty. The African kings who had tried to stop this movement by warning Traore had instead triggered a transformation that was spreading far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The international mining companies that had participated in the original plot against Traore were now facing the prospect of renegotiating contracts worth hundreds of billions of dollars across multiple African countries. The comfortable arrangements that had generated enormous profits while keeping African nations dependent on foreign assistance were suddenly in jeopardy. Western governments that had imposed sanctions on Burkina Faso found themselves dealing with a much larger challenge as their traditional partners in Africa began questioning established relationships. The diplomatic strategies that had worked for decades were proving ineffective against a new generation of African leaders who had popular support for nationalist policies. As the conference moved toward its final day, delegates began working on a document that would be known as the Ouagadougou Declaration on African Resource Sovereignty. The declaration would establish principles for fair resource extraction, requirements for local processing and value addition, and mechanisms for African countries to support each other in implementing independent development policies. The 5 kings who had boycotted the conference watched these developments with growing alarm. Their attempt to stop one rebellious young captain had instead catalyzed the most significant challenge to foreign economic dominance in Africa since the independence era. The question now was whether they would continue their opposition or find a way to adapt to the new reality that Traore had helped create. The final day of the Ouagadougou conference brought a surprise that no one had expected, not even Ibrahim Traore himself. As delegates prepared to sign the historic Declaration on African Resource Sovereignty, a convoy of vehicles arrived at the conference center carrying representatives from the 5 African kings who had initially warned Traore and later boycotted the gathering. Prince Akwasi Agyeman, speaking on behalf of King Otumfuo Osei Tutu II of the Ashanti Kingdom, requested an emergency session with conference leadership. The prince, accompanied by similar representatives from the other traditional rulers, carried a carefully prepared statement that would reshape the entire narrative of the conflict. "We come here today," Prince Agyeman announced to the assembled delegates, "to acknowledge that times have changed, and traditional authority must change with them. We have watched the success of Captain Traore's policies in Burkina Faso, and we have listened to our own people who demand that their leaders serve African interests first." The statement that followed was unprecedented in the history of African traditional authority. The 5 kings formally withdrew their opposition to Traore's policies and acknowledged that their earlier warnings had been influenced by foreign interests rather than genuine concern for African welfare. They requested to join the resource sovereignty movement and offered to use their traditional authority to support the implementation of new policies across the continent. The reversal was stunning, but the reasons behind it were clear to anyone who had been following developments across Africa over the past months. The traditional rulers had faced massive protests from their own subjects, who demanded explanations for their opposition to obviously successful policies. Their legitimacy as representatives of African interests had been seriously damaged by their association with foreign corporations and Western governments. More importantly, the success of the Ouagadougou conference had made it clear that the resource sovereignty movement was not a temporary phenomenon that would fade away. 37 African countries had committed to implementing new policies that would prioritize national development over foreign corporate profits. The movement had gained support from major international powers like China and Russia, as well as from progressive voices in Western countries. The kings had realized that continuing their opposition would leave them completely isolated from the most important political and economic developments on the continent. By joining the movement, they could maintain their relevance and potentially play important roles in implementing the new policies within their traditional territories. Traore's response to the king's reversal demonstrated the strategic thinking that had made him successful throughout the conflict. Rather than rejecting their overtures or humiliating them for their previous opposition, he welcomed their change of position and immediately began discussing ways they could contribute to the resource sovereignty movement. Traditional authority has always been strongest when it serves the people, Traore said in accepting their offer to join the movement. "We welcome the wisdom and influence of our traditional leaders in building a better future for all Africans." The inclusion of the traditional rulers in the final declaration signing ceremony was symbolically powerful. Images of young African presidents standing alongside ancient royal lineages to sign a document asserting African independence from foreign economic domination were broadcast around the world. The visual message was clear. This was not just a political movement led by a few radical leaders, but a comprehensive African renaissance that united modern and traditional authority around shared goals. The Ouagadougou Declaration that was signed on that final day established the most comprehensive framework for African resource sovereignty that had ever been created. The document required all signatory countries to ensure that resource extraction contributed directly to national development through local processing, job creation, and infrastructure investment. It established mechanisms for African countries to share technical expertise and support each other in implementing independent development policies. Perhaps most importantly, the declaration created the African Resource Sovereignty Organization, headquartered in Ouagadougou, which would coordinate continental efforts to develop African resources for African benefit. The organization would provide technical assistance, alternative financing, and diplomatic support to any African country seeking to renegotiate resource extraction agreements with foreign corporations. The international response to the declaration was swift and predictable. Western governments denounced it as destabilizing and contrary to international law. Mining corporations threatened legal action and warned of reduced investment in Africa. International financial institutions suggested that countries signing the declaration would face difficulties accessing development.